The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Sarah Mitchell checked the wagon wheels one last time. Her husband Tom was loading the last of their supplies while their 12-year-old son Jake fed their horses, Thunder and Lightning. They were leaving their small ranch near Tucson to start fresh in California, where Tom's brother had promised them work and good land. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked back at the simple wooden house they had called home for 8 years. The drought had been brutal, killing their crops and most of their cattle. With debts piling up and no rain in sight, they had no choice but to abandon everything and head west. "Ready, Sarah?" Tom called out, climbing onto the wagon seat. His weathered face showed the strain of recent months, but his eyes still held hope for their future. "As ready as we'll ever be," Sarah replied, lifting her long skirt to climb up beside him. Jake jumped into the back of the wagon, settling among their belongings wrapped in canvas and rope. Their neighbor, old Apache Joe, rode up on his spotted horse. He was a mix of Apache and Mexican blood, a man who knew the desert better than anyone. His real name was Jose, but everyone called him Apache Joe because of his incredible tracking skills and knowledge of the wilderness. "You sure about this route, Tom?" Apache Joe asked, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "The main trail is safer even if it takes longer." Tom shook his head. "We can't afford the extra time or supplies. This shortcut through Devil's Canyon will save us 3 days. Besides, you said you'd guide us through?" Apache Joe nodded slowly. "I said I would, and I will. But the desert doesn't forgive mistakes. We need to move fast and stay alert." The wagon creaked as they began their journey, wheels grinding against the rocky ground. Sarah clutched a small bag containing their life savings, just enough to buy supplies in California if they were careful. Everything they owned was either in this wagon or left behind forever. The first day passed without trouble. They followed a barely visible trail that wound between giant saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings. Apache Joe rode ahead, checking for obstacles and the best path forward. The desert was beautiful but harsh, with temperatures rising quickly as the sun climbed higher. Jake entertained himself by counting different types of cacti and trying to spot lizards darting between rocks. Sarah divided her time between watching the scenery and worrying about their water supply. They had enough for 5 days if they were careful, but in the desert, careful might not be enough. As evening approached, Apache Joe signaled for them to stop near a cluster of rocks that would provide some shelter from the wind. Tom unhitched the horses while Sarah gathered dried wood for a small fire. They ate beans and hardtack in comfortable silence, too tired for much conversation. "How far did we come today?" Sarah asked. "About 20 miles, Apache Joe replied, stirring the fire with a stick. "Good progress. Tomorrow we enter the canyon proper. The going gets rougher, but we'll have some protection from the sun." Jake fell asleep quickly on his bedroll, exhausted from the day's excitement. Sarah and Tom sat close together, watching the stars appear in the clear desert sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Think we're doing the right thing?" Tom asked quietly. "We didn't have much choice," Sarah replied. "The ranch was killing us slowly. At least this way we have a chance." Apache Joe was checking on the horses when he suddenly froze. Sarah noticed his stillness and felt her heart skip a beat. The old scout's instincts were legendary, and when he went quiet like that, it usually meant trouble. "What is it?" Tom whispered. Apache Joe held up his hand for silence, then slowly walked back to the fire. "We're being watched," he said in a low voice. "Something's been following us since this afternoon." "Indians?" Tom asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "No," Apache Joe shook his head. "Tracks are wrong for horses. Too small, too many." He paused, listening to the desert night. "Could be coyotes, but they usually don't follow wagons this persistently." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She looked out into the darkness beyond their small fire, imagining eyes watching them from the shadows. The desert that had seemed beautiful during the day now felt threatening and alien. "Should we post a watch?" Tom asked. "Yes," Apache Joe nodded. "I'll take first watch. Tom, you take second. We need to keep the fire going all night. Most predators stay away from fire." They banked the fire carefully and settled in for an uneasy night. Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to every sound. The desert was far from quiet, with insects chirping, wind whistling through rocks, and the occasional call of a night bird. But somewhere in that natural symphony, she thought she heard something else. The soft padding of feet on sand and the rustle of movement in the brush. Apache Joe sat motionless by the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching and listening. His Apache heritage had taught him to read the night like other men read books. He knew the difference between harmless desert sounds and the stealthy movement of hunters. Around midnight, during Tom's watch, they heard it clearly. A long, mournful howl that echoed off the canyon walls. It was answered by another howl from a different direction, then another. Tom woke Apache Joe immediately. "Wolves," Apache Joe said grimly. "Big pack, too. They're calling to each other, coordinating." "I thought wolves didn't live in the desert," Sarah said, having awakened at the sound. "These aren't desert wolves," Apache Joe explained. "They're mountain wolves that come down when prey is scarce. Drought drives them to desperate measures, just like it drove you from your ranch." The howling continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Jake slept through most of it, exhausted by the day's travel, but Sarah and Tom got very little rest. Apache Joe dozed in shifts, always keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of the night. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Apache Joe examined the ground around their camp. His face was serious as he studied the tracks in the sand. "How many?" Tom asked. "At least 8, maybe 10, Apache Joe replied. "Big ones, too. They circled us several times during the night but kept their distance because of the fire." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with fear. "What do we do?" "We keep moving," Apache Joe said firmly. "Wolves are smart, but they're also cautious. As long as we stay together and keep moving, they'll likely look for easier prey." But as they loaded the wagon and prepared to continue their journey into Devil's Canyon, Apache Joe kept his rifle ready and his eyes on the horizon. The tracks told a story he didn't want to share with the Mitchell family just yet. These wolves were hungry, desperate, and they weren't giving up. The second day began with an ominous discovery. As Apache Joe scouted ahead while Tom hitched the horses, he found fresh wolf tracks crossing their intended path. The prints were deep and clear in the morning sand, made sometime after midnight, when the pack had moved closer to investigate their camp. "They're not just following us anymore," Apache Joe told Tom quietly out of Sarah's hearing. "They're trying to get ahead of us, set up an ambush." Tom's face paled. "How do you know?" "See how the tracks spread out here?" Apache Joe pointed to several sets of paw prints that branched off in different directions. "That's pack hunting behavior. They're positioning themselves." The entrance to Devil's Canyon loomed ahead, 2 massive rock walls that created a natural gateway into the desert's most treacherous passage. The canyon was notorious among travelers for its narrow passages, sudden drop-offs, and maze-like side canyons that could trap the unwary, but it was also the fastest route through the mountains, cutting days off their journey. Sarah noticed the tension between the 2 men as they prepared to enter the canyon. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Just the usual desert caution," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Apache Joe wants us to stay extra alert today." Jake was excited about entering the famous canyon. He had heard stories about it from other settlers, tales of lost gold mines and hidden Apache treasure. The 12-year-old had no idea that real danger was stalking them, closing in with each passing hour. The wagon wheels echoed loudly as they entered the canyon, the sound bouncing off the towering walls on either side. The passage was barely wide enough for their wagon, with rocky walls rising hundreds of feet above them. The morning sun created dramatic shadows, turning the canyon into a maze of light and darkness. Apache Joe rode ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the rim of the canyon above them. Wolves were excellent climbers, and the high ground would give them a perfect vantage point to plan an attack. Every rock formation and shadow could hide watching eyes. "Stay close to the wagon," Apache Joe called back to Tom. "Don't let the horses wander even for a moment." The trail through the canyon was rough and unpredictable. Sometimes it widened into small clearings where desert plants struggled to grow in the limited sunlight. Other times it narrowed so much that the wagon wheels scraped against both walls simultaneously. Tom had to navigate carefully around fallen rocks and sudden turns that appeared without warning. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a quick meal. Sarah noticed that Apache Joe barely touched his food, instead spending the time studying the canyon walls above them with his field glasses. "What do you see up there?" she asked. "Movement," Apache Joe replied grimly. Could be shadows, could be something else. Jake climbed onto a large boulder to get a better view of the canyon ahead. Look how far it goes, he called out excitedly. I can see at least 3 more turns from here. Get down from there, Jake, Tom ordered sharply. We need to keep moving. As they resumed their journey, the canyon began to change character. The walls became more jagged and broken, creating dozens of small caves and crevices. The trail also started to climb, winding upward through a series of switchbacks that made the wagon groan with effort. Thunder and lightning were beginning to show signs of stress. The horses kept looking up at the canyon walls, their ears constantly moving as they listened for sounds that humans couldn't detect. Apache Joe noticed their behavior and knew it meant trouble was close. The horses smell them, he told Tom during a brief rest. Wolves have a strong scent that horses fear instinctively. How close are they? Close enough, Apache Joe replied. We need to find a defensive position before nightfall. This canyon has too many places for an ambush. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound echoed ominously through the narrow passage. Sarah found herself jumping at the slightest noise, while Jake remained blissfully unaware of the danger, fascinated by the canyon's geology and the way sounds bounced off the walls. As the sun began to sink lower, casting longer shadows across their path, Apache Joe called a halt near a formation of rocks that created a partial shelter against one canyon wall. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. We'll camp here tonight, he announced. Tom, help me gather rocks to build a barrier. Sarah, get a big fire started and keep it burning bright. Why are we stopping so early? Jake asked. There's still daylight left. Sometimes it's better to choose your ground than have it chosen for you, Apache Joe replied cryptically. As they worked to fortify their position, Apache Joe explained the plan. We'll build up these rocks to create a barrier on 3 sides. The canyon wall protects our backs. We keep the fire burning all night and take turns on watch. What about the wolves? Sarah asked directly, having finally put together the clues from their behavior. Apache Joe looked at her seriously. They're out there, and they're getting bolder. Hunger makes animals do desperate things. But wolves are also smart. They won't attack a prepared position unless they're absolutely sure they can win. As darkness fell over the canyon, the temperature dropped quickly. Sarah wrapped herself in a heavy blanket and helped Jake prepare his bedroll close to the fire. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. Tom and Apache Joe checked their rifles and made sure they had plenty of ammunition. They also prepared torches that could be lit quickly if needed. Fire was their best weapon against wolves, who instinctively feared the flames. The first howl came just after full darkness settled over the canyon. It started as a single, long call that seemed to come from directly above them, somewhere on the canyon rim. The sound echoed and multiplied as it bounced off the rock walls, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to surround them completely. Jake sat up quickly, his eyes wide with fear and excitement. Was that really a wolf? Yes, Apache Joe said simply, and there are more coming. The howling continued, with different voices joining in from various directions. It was clear that the pack was large and positioning itself around their camp. Sarah pulled Jake closer to her side, trying to comfort him while fighting her own rising panic. Why don't they just attack? Tom asked. They're testing us, Apache Joe explained. Wolves study their prey before attacking. They want to know how many we are, how well armed, how we react to pressure. As if to prove his point, a large gray shape appeared briefly at the edge of their firelight, just long enough to be seen before melting back into the darkness. Then another appeared on the opposite side, and another. They're circling us, Tom said, raising his rifle. Don't shoot unless they attack, Apache Joe warned. Gunfire in this canyon will create echoes that could cause a rock slide. Besides, we need to save our ammunition. The night became a tense standoff. The wolves continued their psychological warfare, appearing and disappearing at the edge of the light, howling from different positions, testing the humans' nerves and defenses. Sarah found herself gripping Tom's arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Around midnight during Tom's watch, the wolves made their first real probe. 3 of them approached the rock barrier simultaneously, moving with fluid grace through the shadows. Apache Joe woke instantly, his rifle ready. "Easy," he whispered to Tom. "Let them come closer." The lead wolf was massive, probably weighing over 100 pounds, with intelligent yellow eyes that reflected the firelight. It studied their defenses, carefully, noting the height of the rock barrier, the position of the humans, and the brightness of the fire. After several tense minutes, the wolf pack leader turned and disappeared back into the darkness. The message was clear. They were being evaluated, and the final test was yet to come. Dawn brought little relief to the exhausted travelers. Sarah had managed only an hour of real sleep, while Tom and Apache Joe had shared watch duties throughout the long night. Jake, surprisingly, had slept through most of the wolves' testing behavior, waking only when the howling grew particularly loud. The evidence of their nocturnal visitors was everywhere in the morning light. Wolf tracks circled their makeshift camp in a complex pattern that told the story of careful reconnaissance. Apache Joe studied the prints with growing concern. "They mapped out our entire position," he told Tom while Sarah prepared a quick breakfast. "Every weakness, every angle of approach. These aren't ordinary wolves driven by simple hunger." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, checking his rifle and counting their remaining ammunition. "This pack has dealt with humans before," Apache Joe explained. "Probably attacked other wagon trains or settlements. They know our weapons, our tactics, our weaknesses." The realization sent a chill through Tom's bones. They weren't just dealing with wild animals following instinct, but with intelligent predators who had learned to hunt the most dangerous prey of all. As they packed the wagon, Apache Joe made a disturbing discovery. The wolves had tested their defenses during the night by moving some of the rocks in their barrier. Not enough to create an opening, but enough to probe the stability of their fortifications. They were seeing if they could create a gap to attack through, he explained. When that didn't work, they tried a different approach. He pointed to scratch marks on the canyon wall behind their camp. They attempted to climb down from above. Only the firelight kept them from completing the approach. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You mean they were right above us while we slept?" "At least one of them was," Apache Joe confirmed. "Probably scouting for the pack leader." They resumed their journey through Devil's Canyon with heavy hearts and frayed nerves. The trail continued to climb through increasingly difficult terrain, forcing them to navigate around massive boulder fields and across narrow ledges that made Sarah dizzy to look down from. The horses were showing more signs of stress with each passing hour. Thunder kept shying at shadows, while Lightning's ears constantly swiveled toward sounds only he could hear. Their fear was affecting their performance, making them less reliable just when reliability mattered most. Around midday, they reached a section of canyon where the trail split into 3 possible routes. Apache Joe dismounted to study each path carefully, looking for signs of recent passage and checking the condition of the trails ahead. "Which way?" Tom asked impatiently. Every moment they spent stationary felt like giving the wolves more time to position themselves for an attack. "The middle path is shortest," Apache Joe replied, "but it goes through a narrow gorge where we'd be trapped if anything went wrong. The left path is safest, but adds half a day to our journey. The right path—" He paused, studying something in the sand. "What about the right path?" "Fresh wolf sign," Apache Joe said grimly. "They went this way this morning, probably to set up an ambush ahead of us." Tom wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool canyon air. "So we take the left path?" "That's what they expect us to do," Apache Joe replied. "The safe route, the predictable choice. But sometimes the most dangerous path is actually the safest one." After several minutes of consideration, Apache Joe made his decision. "We take the middle route. The narrow gorge will work both ways. They can't surround us there, and we only have to defend from front and back." The middle trail proved even more challenging than Apache Joe had indicated. The canyon walls closed in until they were barely 10 feet apart, forcing Tom to drive with extreme precision to avoid scraping the wagon wheels. The sound of their passage echoed loudly in the confined space, announcing their location to anything within miles. Jake found the narrow passage exciting rather than frightening, calling out observations about the rock formations and the way sounds bounced between the walls. His youthful enthusiasm provided a welcome distraction from the tension that gripped the adults. "Look at those scratches on the wall," Jake pointed out. "Something big must have made those marks." Apache Joe examined the scratches Jake had spotted and his expression darkened. They were claw marks, definitely from a large predator, and they were recent. Something had been climbing these walls, possibly within the last few days. Bear? Tom asked hopefully. Wrong pattern, Apache Joe replied. These are from multiple animals working together. Wolves, helping each other climb to higher positions. The narrow gorge continued for over a mile, winding through the mountain in a serpentine pattern that prevented them from seeing more than 50 yards ahead at any time. Every turn could hide an ambush. Every shadow could conceal waiting predators. As they navigated a particularly sharp bend, Thunder suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, refusing to move forward despite Tom's urging. The horse's ears were flat against his head, and his nostrils flared with obvious fear. Something's wrong, Apache Joe said, dismounting quickly with his rifle ready. Thunder's got the best nose of any horse I know. If he won't go forward, there's a good reason. Apache Joe crept ahead on foot, using the rocky walls for cover as he scouted the trail ahead. What he found confirmed Thunder's instincts. Fresh wolf droppings were scattered across the trail, and the sand showed clear signs of a pack gathering in this exact spot. They were here, he reported back to the wagon, recently, probably waiting for us to come around that bend. Where are they now? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. Apache Joe pointed upward to the canyon rim high above them. Up there, most likely, watching us, deciding when to make their move. As if summoned by his words, a lone howl echoed from somewhere overhead. It was answered immediately by another call from the opposite side of the canyon, then another from behind them. The pack was in position and they were ready. We need to move fast, Apache Joe said, swinging back onto his horse. This gorge won't protect us much longer. Tom whipped the reins, urging Thunder and Lightning forward at a pace that was dangerous on the rocky trail, but necessary given their circumstances. The wagon bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, its wooden frame creaking ominously with each impact. Behind them, they could hear the sound of rocks falling, as if something large was descending the canyon walls. The wolves had made their decision and the hunt was beginning in earnest. There, Jake shouted, pointing ahead. I can see the end of the gorge. Sure enough, the canyon walls were beginning to widen, and daylight showed the promise of open space ahead. But Apache Joe knew that reaching the end of the gorge might not mean safety. In fact, it might be exactly where the wolves wanted them to be. As they emerged from the narrow passage into a circular clearing surrounded by canyon walls, Apache Joe's worst fears were confirmed. The area was perfect for an ambush, with multiple access points from above and limited escape routes. The wolves had herded them exactly where they wanted them. Keep moving, Apache Joe shouted. Don't stop in the clearing. But even as Tom urged the horses forward, shapes began appearing on the canyon rim above them. Large gray forms moving with purpose and intelligence, positioning themselves for what would clearly be the final confrontation. The pack had finished its evaluation. The hunt was about to begin. The circular clearing was roughly 100 yards across, with steep canyon walls rising on all sides like the walls of a natural amphitheater. Ancient rock slides had created jumbled piles of boulders that offered both cover and concealment, but also countless hiding places for predators. Apache Joe realized immediately that they had been maneuvered into a killing ground. This is bad, he muttered, scanning the rim of the canyon where dark shapes continued to appear. They've been planning this for hours, maybe since yesterday. Tom drove the wagon toward the far side of the clearing, hoping to find another exit from the canyon system. But as they approached the opposite wall, it became clear that there was no way out. The clearing was a box canyon, a natural trap with only one entrance and no escape routes. We're trapped, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not trapped, Apache Joe corrected firmly. Cornered. There's a difference. Trapped animals give up. Cornered animals fight back. The first wolf appeared at ground level near the entrance they had just used. It was the massive pack leader Apache Joe had seen the night before, its yellow eyes intelligent and calculating. The animal moved with complete confidence, no longer bothering to hide its presence. Within minutes, other wolves began descending into the clearing using paths invisible to human eyes. They moved down the canyon walls like water flowing over rocks, finding footholds and handholds that seemed impossible for such large animals. The pack was bigger than Apache Joe had estimated, at least 12 animals, possibly more. "Tom, get the wagon into those rocks," Apache Joe ordered, pointing toward the largest pile of boulders. "We need something solid at our backs." Tom guided thunder and lightning toward the rock formation, the horses now so terrified they were responding purely to his commands rather than their own judgment. The scent of wolves was overwhelming their natural instincts, reducing them to barely controlled panic. Jake finally understood the true nature of their situation as he watched the wolves spread out around the clearing with military precision. "They're really going to attack us, aren't they?" he asked, his young voice shaking. "Yes," Apache Joe replied honestly, "but we're not helpless. We have weapons, fire, and intelligence. Wolves may be smart, but humans are smarter." Sarah began unpacking everything flammable from the wagon: dried cloth, cooking oil, wooden items that could be broken up for kindling. If fire was their best defense, she was determined to have plenty of fuel available. Apache Joe studied the pack's positioning with professional interest. The wolves had divided into 3 groups. The largest group blocked their retreat. A second group covered the left side of the clearing, and a third group was positioning itself on the right. It was a classic hunting formation designed to prevent escape and funnel prey toward the strongest attackers. "They've done this before," he told Tom grimly. "This isn't instinct, it's learned behavior. Somewhere, somehow, this pack has successfully hunted humans." The pack leader made a low sound, barely audible to human ears but clearly meaningful to the other wolves. 3 animals immediately broke away from the main group and began a slow approach toward the wagon, moving in a loose line formation. "Here they come," Apache Joe said, raising his rifle. "Tom, you take the one on the left. I'll take the middle. Sarah, get that fire started now." The wolves approached with surprising caution, testing the humans' reactions and defensive capabilities. They were close enough now for everyone to see their size and condition clearly. These were not starving animals driven by desperation, but healthy, well-fed predators who had chosen to hunt the most dangerous prey available. "Why aren't they rushing us?" Tom asked, his rifle trained on the approaching wolves. "Because they're smart enough to know that desperate prey is dangerous prey," Apache Joe replied. "They want to wear us down first, make us make mistakes." The lead wolf in the approaching trio suddenly feinted toward the wagon, not close enough to attack, but close enough to test their responses. Apache Joe held his fire, knowing that premature shooting would waste precious ammunition and possibly trigger a full attack before they were ready. Sarah got a small fire started using matches and dried grass, feeding it carefully with larger pieces of wood from their supplies. The smoke rose straight up in the still canyon air, and she realized with horror that the fire was actually helping the wolves by marking their exact position. "The fire's making smoke signals," she told Apache Joe. "Doesn't matter now," he replied. "They already know exactly where we are." Jake surprised everyone by picking up his father's spare rifle and checking to make sure it was loaded. At 12, he was already an experienced hunter of small game, and his hands were steady as he prepared for what might be his first real battle. "I can shoot too," he announced quietly. Tom started to protest, but Apache Joe cut him off. "Let the boy help. We need every advantage we can get." The wolves continued their psychological warfare, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, testing different approaches, probing for weaknesses in the human's defensive position. Their patience was extraordinary, showing a level of tactical thinking that was both impressive and terrifying. Around mid-afternoon, the pack made its first serious probe. 5 wolves approached simultaneously from different directions, coordinating their movement with subtle signals. They came close enough to force the humans to make shooting decisions, then melted away before any clear shots could be taken. "They're learning our range and reaction time," Apache Joe explained after the wolves withdrew. "Next time they'll adjust their tactics based on what they observed." The afternoon wore on with increasing tension. The wolves never stopped moving, never stopped testing, never stopped applying pressure. They were like water finding cracks in a dam, constantly probing for the weak point that would lead to total collapse. As the sun began to sink toward the canyon rim, Apache Joe made a disturbing observation. "They're not trying to drive us out of the clearing," he told Tom. "They're keeping us here deliberately. Why would they want us to stay?" "Because they hunt better in darkness," Apache Joe replied. "They're waiting for nightfall." The realization hit everyone simultaneously. The wolves hadn't been trying to attack during the day because they didn't need to. They were simply keeping the humans pinned in position until darkness gave them every possible advantage. "How long until sunset?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Apache Joe studied the angle of light on the canyon walls. 2 hours, maybe less. Sarah looked at their supplies: limited ammunition, a small fire that would need constant feeding, and food and water that wouldn't last more than another day or two. If they were going to survive this encounter, it would have to be resolved before their resources ran out. "We can't wait for them to attack on their terms," she said suddenly. "We need to force them to fight during daylight when we have the advantage." Apache Joe looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "What are you thinking?" "Fire," Sarah said simply. "Not just for defense, but as a weapon. If we can't get out of this clearing, maybe we can make the wolves want to leave." Tom understood immediately. "Start a brush fire, drive them back." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "There's plenty of dry vegetation around the edges of the clearing. If we can get a good fire going upwind of their positions." Apache Joe considered the plan carefully. It was risky, potentially as dangerous to them as to the wolves, but it had one crucial advantage. It would force an immediate resolution instead of allowing the pack to wait for optimal hunting conditions. "It could work," he admitted. "But once we start that fire, there's no going back. We'll have to be ready for them to attack immediately, before the flames spread enough to drive them away." As they prepared to implement Sarah's desperate plan, the pack leader seemed to sense that something had changed. The massive wolf moved to a prominent position on a boulder and stared directly at the humans, its yellow eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. The final battle was about to begin. Sarah's plan required careful preparation and perfect timing. They had to create fire arrows using cloth strips soaked in cooking oil, tied to regular arrows that Tom and Apache Joe could shoot accurately into the dry brush around the clearing's perimeter. Jake would tend their central fire and keep it burning bright, while the adults focused on creating the barrier of flames. "Remember," Apache Joe warned as they prepared their makeshift incendiary weapons, "once we light up that brush, the wolves will know they have limited time to attack. They'll come at us with everything they have." Tom wrapped oil-soaked cloth around 3 arrow points, making sure the fabric was tight enough to stay lit during flight, but loose enough to catch fire easily. "How many shots do you think we'll get before they charge?" "Maybe 6 if we're lucky," Apache Joe replied. "The wind is right for spreading fire along the north side of the clearing. If we can get a good blaze going there, it'll force them to attack from only 2 directions instead of 3. Sarah took inventory of their remaining supplies. "We have enough oil for about 10 fire arrows, but after that we'll be down to regular ammunition." "How many bullets do we have left?" "Counting Jake's rifle, maybe 30 rounds total," Tom answered. "Not much for a prolonged fight." The wolves seemed to sense the increased activity around the wagon. Several of them moved closer, no longer bothering to hide their presence. The pack leader remained on his boulder perch, watching the humans' preparations with obvious intelligence. "They know something's changed," Jake observed, his young voice steadier than anyone expected. "Look how they're positioning themselves differently." Apache Joe followed Jake's gaze and realized the boy was right. The wolves were abandoning their patient encirclement strategy and forming up for what looked like an immediate assault. Somehow they had sensed that the humans were planning something that would change the nature of the standoff. "We need to start now," Apache Joe decided. "They're not going to give us much more time to prepare." Tom lit the first fire arrow from their central campfire, the oil-soaked cloth bursting into flame immediately. He drew back his bow, aimed at a thick patch of dry brush about 50 yards away, and released. The arrow arced through the air like a tiny comet, landing precisely where he had aimed. The brush caught fire instantly, the dry vegetation igniting with a whooshing sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Within seconds, flames were spreading along the ground and up into larger shrubs, creating the beginning of what they hoped would become an effective barrier. Apache Joe followed with his own fire arrow, targeting a different section of brush to extend the line of flames. His shot was equally accurate, and soon 2 separate fires were beginning to merge into a single burning barrier. The effect on the wolf pack was immediate and dramatic. The animals that had been positioned behind the burning brush began moving rapidly toward other positions, clearly agitated by the fire, but not yet ready to abandon their attack entirely. "It's working," Sarah called out, but her celebration was premature. The pack leader let out a sharp bark that was clearly a command signal. Instead of retreating from the fire, the entire pack began moving toward the wagon with deadly purpose. The wolves had decided to attack immediately, before the flames could spread enough to trap them. "Here they come," Apache Joe shouted, dropping his bow and grabbing his rifle. "All of them at once." The coordinated assault was terrifying to witness. 12 large wolves charged across the clearing from 3 directions simultaneously, their movement fluid and purposeful. These were not panicked animals fleeing from fire, but disciplined hunters executing a battle plan. Tom fired his first shot at the lead wolf on the left flank, hitting the animal in the shoulder and spinning it around. The wolf stumbled but didn't go down, limping away from the immediate attack but not out of the fight entirely. Apache Joe's first shot was more accurate, dropping the largest wolf in the center group with a clean hit to the chest. But there was no time to celebrate as 2 more wolves immediately took its place, leaping over their fallen packmate without hesitation. Jake surprised everyone by firing his rifle with remarkable accuracy for someone his age. His shot caught a wolf mid-leap, sending the animal tumbling into the rocks with a yelp of pain. The boy immediately began reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Sarah grabbed a burning branch from their fire and swung it at a wolf that had somehow gotten close to the wagon. The animal backed away from the flames but didn't retreat far, circling just outside the range of her improvised torch while looking for an opening. "The horses!" Tom shouted in alarm. Thunder and lightning were in full panic now, rearing and pulling against their harnesses as wolves approached from multiple directions. If the horses broke free and ran, the family would lose not only their transportation but also their mobile shelter and supplies. Apache Joe made a split-second decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of continuing to shoot at individual wolves, he grabbed one of the remaining fire arrows and shot it directly into a pile of dry brush between the attacking wolves and the horses. The explosion of flame created a temporary barrier that forced the wolves to split their attack. "Keep that fire burning," he yelled to Sarah while reloading his rifle. "It's the only thing keeping them from overrunning us." The battle became a desperate struggle for survival. The wolves pressed their attack with intelligence and coordination, using the rocks for cover and attacking from unexpected angles. Every time the humans thought they had driven off one group, another group would appear from a different direction. Tom's second shot missed completely as a wolf dodged at the last second, the bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall with a sharp whine. He was shaking now, the stress of the prolonged siege finally affecting his marksmanship. Jake proved to be surprisingly effective, his smaller size allowing him to find shooting positions among the rocks that the adults couldn't use. His third shot wounded another wolf, though not fatally. The injured animal retreated but remained part of the pack, adding to the growing number of wounded but still dangerous predators circling their position. "We're not killing enough of them fast enough," Apache Joe called out during a brief lull in the attack. "They can afford to lose a few pack members. We can't afford to miss any more shots." As if responding to his words, the pack leader appeared on a high rock directly above the wagon. The massive wolf had found a climbing route that brought him to a perfect attack position, and he was preparing to leap down among them. Sarah saw the danger first. "Above us!" she screamed, pointing upward. Apache Joe spun around and fired without taking time to aim properly. His shot was hurried and slightly off target, hitting the rock next to the pack leader instead of the wolf itself. But the impact of the bullet and the shower of rock chips was enough to spoil the wolf's leap. Instead of landing among the humans, the pack leader crashed into the side of the wagon, his claws raking long gouges in the wooden sides before he rolled away into the rocks. He was stunned but not seriously injured, and within moments he was back on his feet and looking for another opportunity. "How many rounds do we have left?" Tom asked while frantically reloading. "Maybe 15, Apache Joe replied, not counting Jake's rifle. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly grim. With at least 8 wolves still in fighting condition and limited ammunition remaining, they were facing the very real possibility of being overrun before they could kill or drive off enough attackers to end the threat. But Sarah's fire strategy was beginning to show results. The flames from their fire arrows had spread into a significant blaze along one side of the clearing, and the smoke was creating confusion among the wolves. More importantly, the fire was limiting the pack's ability to surround them completely. "We need to get out of this clearing," Apache Joe said suddenly. "The fire has created an opening. If we can get the wagon moving, we might be able to break through their lines." Tom looked at the narrow gap between the flames and the remaining wolves. It's risky. If we get caught in the open, we're going to get caught here anyway, Apache Joe replied. At least if we're moving, we have a chance. The decision made, they began preparing for what would either be their escape or their final stand. Sarah doused several pieces of cloth with their remaining oil, creating torches they could use to keep the wolves at bay during their dash for freedom. Jake checked his ammunition one more time. I have 4 bullets left, he announced. Save them, Apache Joe advised. We'll need every shot once we start moving. As they prepared to make their desperate break for freedom, the pack leader seemed to sense their intention. He let out a long howl that was answered immediately by the surviving members of his pack. The wolves were preparing for their own final assault, determined not to let their prey escape. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation that would determine whether the Mitchell family lived to see California or became another cautionary tale of the dangers lurking in Devil's Canyon. Hang on, keep driving, Sarah shouted as the wagon lurched forward, wheels spinning on loose gravel before finding purchase on solid rock. Tom had thunder and lightning moving at a dangerous pace through the gap between the spreading fire and the regrouping wolf pack. But their escape route was narrowing with each passing second. Apache Joe rode alongside the wagon, his rifle ready, scanning for wolves that might try to intercept their dash for freedom. The remaining pack members were moving to cut them off, but the fire had disrupted their coordination enough to create the opening they desperately needed. There, Apache Joe pointed toward a narrow trail leading out of the clearing. Head for that gap between the rocks. The trail was barely wide enough for the wagon with steep drops on both sides, but it was their only chance of escape from the killing ground. Tom whipped the reins, urging the terrified horses toward what looked like an impossible passage. Behind them, the pack leader had recovered from his collision with the wagon and was now leading a final charge to prevent their escape. 8 wolves were racing across the clearing in a desperate attempt to reach the wagon before it could navigate the narrow trail to safety. Jake turned around in the wagon bed, his rifle trained on the pursuing wolves. They're gaining on us, he called out, his young voice tight with fear but still steady. Don't shoot unless they get close enough to jump on the wagon, Apache Joe instructed. We need to save ammunition for what's ahead. The wagon reached the entrance to the narrow trail just as the fastest wolf launched itself toward the rear of the vehicle. Sarah swung her burning torch in a wide arc, the flames catching the animal across the muzzle and sending it tumbling away with a howl of pain and rage. Got him, she shouted triumphantly, but her celebration was cut short as the wagon wheels hit a series of rocks that nearly overturned the entire vehicle. Tom fought to control the panicked horses as they entered the narrow passage between towering canyon walls. The trail was treacherous, winding upward through a maze of fallen boulders and sharp turns that required all his skill to navigate safely. Apache Joe was forced to dismount and lead his horse on foot through the narrowest sections, staying close to the wagon in case the wolves found another way to attack. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, indicating that at least some of the pack was following them into the passage. How far does this trail go? Sarah asked, clutching Jake protectively as the wagon bounced over the rough terrain. Don't know, Apache Joe replied honestly, but it has to lead somewhere. This whole canyon system was carved by water, so there has to be a way out eventually. The trail continued to climb steeply, winding back and forth up the canyon wall in a series of switchbacks that tested both the horse's endurance and Tom's driving skills. The wagon was never designed for such terrain, and every joint and wheel was straining under the punishment. Behind them, they could hear the wolves' frustration as the pack tried to follow the wagon up the narrow trail. The animals were excellent climbers, but the steep terrain and loose rocks were slowing them down significantly. I think we're losing them, Jake reported, watching their back trail carefully. Don't count on it, Apache Joe warned. Wolves are persistent hunters. They won't give up easily. As if to prove his point, a howl echoed from somewhere above them. The pack leader had found an alternate route and was trying to get ahead of the wagon to set up another ambush. He's above us somewhere, Apache Joe said, scanning the canyon walls nervously, probably looking for a place to jump down on us. The trail took a sharp turn around a massive boulder, temporarily blocking their view of what lay ahead. Tom was forced to slow the horses to navigate the blind corner safely, but as they came around the rock, they found themselves facing an impossible obstacle. A rock slide had blocked the trail completely, creating a barrier of boulders and debris that no wagon could possibly cross. They were trapped between the pursuing wolves and an impassable wall of stone. "End of the road," Tom said grimly, bringing the wagon to a halt. "No," Apache Joe said firmly, studying the rock slide carefully. "Look there on the left side. There's a gap big enough for people on foot, maybe even for the horses if we unpack them." Sarah looked at the narrow opening he was indicating. "What about the wagon?" "All our supplies. We take what we can carry and leave the rest," Apache Joe replied. "Better to lose our possessions than our lives." The sound of approaching wolves made the decision urgent. The pack had followed them up the trail and would reach their position within minutes. They had to choose between making a stand with the wagon as shelter or abandoning it to escape through the gap in the rock slide. "Start unpacking," Tom ordered. "Take only what we absolutely need to survive." Sarah began sorting through their belongings with desperate efficiency, selecting essential items, water containers, some food, ammunition, basic tools, and warm clothing. Everything else would have to be left behind. Jake helped by gathering the lightest but most valuable items: matches, medicine, and the small bag containing their life savings. At 12 years old, he understood that they were abandoning their old life completely and starting over with almost nothing. Apache Joe kept watch while the family packed, his rifle ready for the wolves' arrival. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, including the scratch of claws on rock that indicated the pack was climbing the trail rather than following the easier path. "They'll be here in 2 minutes," he warned. "Whatever we're taking, we need to take it now." Tom began unhitching Thunder and Lightning from the wagon, working as quickly as possible to free the horses from their harnesses. The animals would be essential for carrying supplies and potentially for riding if they found a way out of the canyon system. There, Sarah pointed to a ledge above them where the distinctive silhouette of the pack leader appeared. "He found his way around us." The massive wolf stared down at them for a moment, his yellow eyes calculating the distance for a potential jump. Then he threw back his head and howled, calling the rest of the pack to his position. "Move. Now," Apache Joe shouted. Sarah grabbed the most essential supplies and headed for the gap in the rock slide, with Jake close behind her carrying his rifle and the precious bag of money. Tom followed with Thunder and Lightning, coaxing the nervous horses toward the narrow opening. Apache Joe remained behind for a moment, taking aim at the pack leader on the ledge above. His shot was true, hitting the massive wolf in the shoulder and sending him tumbling down into the rocks below. The animal wasn't dead, but he was injured enough to slow down the pack's immediate pursuit. As Apache Joe turned to follow the others through the gap, he could hear the rest of the pack arriving at the abandoned wagon. The wolves would investigate their former shelter, but it wouldn't take them long to figure out where the humans had gone. The gap in the rock slide was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance. Sarah had to turn sideways to squeeze through, and the horses required careful coaxing to navigate the tight passage. On the other side, they found themselves on a ledge overlooking a completely different section of the canyon system. "Which way now?" Tom asked, looking at the unfamiliar terrain spread out below them. Apache Joe studied the landscape carefully, looking for signs of water, vegetation, or any indication of a route that might lead to safety. In the distance, he could see what looked like a river valley, but reaching it would require descending several hundred feet of steep, rocky terrain. "There," he pointed toward the distant valley. "If we can get down to that river, we can follow it out of the mountains." Behind them, they could hear the wolves discovering the gap in the rock slide. The pack would follow them through the passage, but the difficult terrain would slow the pursuit considerably. As they began their perilous descent toward the valley floor, Sarah looked back one last time at the wagon that had carried their dreams of a new life in California. Everything they had owned was now abandoned in Devil's Canyon, but they were still alive, still together, and still moving toward their destination. The real test of their survival was just beginning. The descent toward the river valley tested every ounce of strength and courage the Mitchell family possessed. Apache Joe led the way, finding the safest route down the treacherous canyon wall while constantly watching for signs of the pursuing wolf pack. The rocky terrain that made their descent so difficult would also slow down their pursuers. But wolves were natural climbers and wouldn't be stopped for long. Thunder and Lightning proved their worth during the dangerous climb, carefully picking their way down steep sections that would have been impossible for humans to navigate. while carrying heavy packs. The horses seemed to understand that their survival depended on reaching the valley floor safely. "How far to the river?" Sarah asked during a brief rest on a narrow ledge. The descent was taking longer than expected, and the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the canyon rim high above them. "Maybe another hour," Apache Joe replied, studying the terrain below. "But we need to keep moving. Those wolves haven't given up." As if summoned by his words, a distant howl echoed from somewhere above them. The pack had found their trail and was beginning its own descent, following the same route the humans had taken through the rockslide gap. Jake counted their remaining supplies as they prepared to continue down the canyon wall. "We have water for 2 days, maybe 3 if we're careful. Food for about the same." "The river should solve our water problems," Tom said optimistically, "and there might be fish or other game in the valley." They resumed their descent as the shadows grew longer, each step bringing them closer to what they hoped would be safety. The river valley looked more promising as they got closer, with green vegetation indicating a reliable water source and possibly easier travel. Apache Joe called a halt when they were still 50 feet above the valley floor. "Listen," he said quietly. In the distance they could hear the sound of running water, but there was something else: human voices and the sound of chopping wood. Someone else was camped in the valley, and they were close enough to reach before dark. "Other travelers?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Could be," Apache Joe replied cautiously. "Or it could be trouble of a different kind. Not everyone you meet in these canyons is friendly." They completed their descent carefully, emerging from the rocks into a valley that was green and welcoming after the harsh desert landscape above. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, bordered by cottonwood trees and lush grass that would provide excellent forage for the horses. The human voices were coming from around a bend in the stream, perhaps a quarter mile from where they had emerged from the canyon wall. Apache Joe scouted ahead on foot, while the Mitchell family waited with the horses, ready to retreat back into the rocks if necessary. He returned within minutes with good news. "It's a family of emigrants like yourselves," he reported. "German folks with 2 wagons heading for California. They've been camped here for 3 days waiting for a sick child to recover enough to travel." The relief in Sarah's voice was obvious. "Thank God. I was beginning to think we'd never see another friendly face." The German family, the Millers, welcomed the bedraggled survivors with typical frontier hospitality. Hans Miller was a big bearded man who immediately offered to share their fire and food. His wife Greta tended to the minor injuries the Mitchell family had suffered during their escape, while their teenage children helped care for Thunder and Lightning. "Wolf pack, you say?" Hans asked in heavily accented English as they shared a meal around the campfire. "We heard howling for 2 nights, but they never came close to our camp." "These weren't ordinary wolves," Apache Joe explained. "They were pack hunters who knew how to coordinate attacks against humans." "Very dangerous," Greta Miller shuddered. "Our little Anna has been sick with fever. If wolves had attacked while she was so weak, they probably avoided your camp because you have 2 wagons and more people," Apache Joe assured her. "Wolves prefer to attack when they have numerical superiority." As night fell over the valley, they organized a watch schedule that would protect both families. The Muellers had more weapons and ammunition, while Apache Joe provided expertise in dealing with wilderness threats. Jake fell asleep quickly for the first time in days, exhausted by their ordeal, but feeling safe surrounded by other people. Sarah and Tom sat close together by the fire, finally allowing themselves to believe they had survived their encounter with the pack. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked quietly. "We lost everything except what we could carry." "We start over," Tom replied firmly. "Hans says there's room in one of their wagons for our essential supplies. We can travel with them to California and figure out the rest when we get there." Apache Joe had been studying the canyon walls above them, watching for any sign that the wolves had followed them into the valley. "The pack is still up there somewhere," he said. "They might come down tonight, or they might decide we're not worth the effort now that we're with a larger group." Around midnight, during Hans Mueller's watch, the question was answered. A series of howls echoed through the valley, but they were distant and seemed to be moving away from the stream rather than toward it. "They're leaving," Apache Joe said with satisfaction. "The pack has decided to look for easier prey." The next morning brought fresh hope and new possibilities. Little Anna Mueller's fever had broken during the night, and she was strong enough to travel. The combined group would head west together, following the stream out of the canyon system toward the main California trail. Sarah sorted through the supplies she had managed to save from their wagon, amazed at how little remained of their former life. The bag of money was still intact, along with some basic tools and clothing, but everything else was gone. "It's enough," she told Tom as they prepared to continue their journey. "We're alive, we're together, and we're still heading for California. That's what matters." Jake had made friends with the Muller children and was excited about traveling with a larger group. The adventure aspects of their journey appealed to his 12-year-old imagination, though he would never forget the terror of being hunted by the wolf pack. Apache Joe prepared to leave them at the mouth of the valley, where the stream joined a larger river that would eventually lead to the main emigrant trail. His job was finished and he had other responsibilities waiting back in Arizona. "You sure you won't come to California with us?" Tom asked as they prepared to part ways. Apache Joe smiled and shook his head. "The desert is my home. Besides, someone needs to warn other travelers about that wolf pack. They're still out there and they're still dangerous." As the two families continued west together, following the river toward their dreams of a new life in California, Sarah looked back one last time at Devil's Canyon. They had lost almost everything material, but they had gained something invaluable: the knowledge that they could survive anything when they worked together. The wolves had taught them about their own strength and resilience. In trying to destroy the Mitchell family, the pack had actually forged them into something stronger than they had been before. They were no longer just hopeful immigrants heading west. They were survivors who had looked death in the face and refused to surrender. 3 months later, they reached the California goldfields, where Tom found work and eventually saved enough money to buy land. Sarah opened a small store that served other immigrants, while Jake grew up to become one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. But none of them ever forgot the lesson they learned in Devil's Canyon. Sometimes the most dangerous paths lead to the greatest discoveries about what you're truly capable of achieving. The wolves had tested them and found them unbreakable, and that knowledge would serve them well in all the challenges that lay ahead in their new life.